no legal or administrative process that's actually in place, and that is the problem. So Malaysia tries to get away with saying that it has not ratified the 1951 UN Refugee Convention or the 67 protocols, and therefore it does not have a responsibility to protect the rights and interests of refugees. So what happens is that they are lumped together as migrant workers, and when there are raids by immigration, or when the involuntary police force RELA does a raid, they get arrested and detained as well. So this is what is happening in the country. But having said that, I think it's also about time that we started shifting the conversation. Instead of saying that Malaysia has not ratified the convention and so it does not have a responsibility, it's really time that Malaysia is reminded repeatedly that it does have a responsibility, because it has ratified the Child Rights Convention, it has ratified the Convention Against All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW. It is aligned with Sustainable Development Goals of 2030, which means that it has, under international conventions and international human rights law, also a responsibility. And just now, Tehmina spoke about the pushback, the Rohingya boat pushback. So, here Malaysia is clearly in violation of the international maritime law, which clearly says that when that any government has a right to rescue people at sea who are in distress. Now, we have failed to do that. So, and we get away with it, or the government thinks that it can get away with it because it has not ratified the convention. And so there are absolutely no need to vet them. There is no legal or administrative framework that has been put in place to do so. And I really think we are a host to about 500,000 refugees. And it's really high time that the Malaysian government looks at a way to actually process them and to look into ways in which they can be integrated into the society, ways in which they can be allowed to work, ways in which access to education and healthcare can be made possible for them, so that we can play a part, we can discharge our global responsibility as a government.
Absolutely. So just to add on to that, I, not just as a journalist, but just as an observer of media in Malaysia as well, I highly, combat the perspective that there is a sudden flood of refugees. And I think it's very important to critically analyze the fact that the politics of the government of the day goes hand in hand with the marginalization and the suppression of vulnerable communities, such as refugees and migrants. So to put it into perspective, there is absolutely no sudden flood of refugees or migrants into Malaysia. This issue has been in existence for decades. It is also compounded by the fact that Malaysia is a peninsula. So geographically speaking, we have extremely porous boundaries. And what this literally means in practical terms is that refugees and migrants can arrive not only by boat, but also via land and etc. at various penetration points in and around the entire peninsula of Malaysia. So that is how actually, as Mahi was referring to the numbers earlier, we've got close to 500,000 refugees. And this didn't suddenly happen, let's say, in 2018. It has been happening cumulatively over the last couple of decades. This is also compounded by the fact that there is a high level of corruption within the system of migration as well. So such as just in Johor about 2 days ago, in excess of 15 individuals working with the Immigration and Customs Department were actually taken under remand because these officers were actually working hand in hand with human traffickers. So it is a multifarious issue. And it does appear that the manner in which progress is happening is far too slow, because at the same time, external pressures for all the refugees and migrants from their home countries are increasing. And this is actually something which is quite normal during times of crisis. We are living through the COVID-19 pandemic globally, and this has naturally put increasing pressures on already pressurized communities made vulnerable in their home countries. And also the lumping together of refugees, the stateless individuals and migrants all together in one sort of homogeneous group is absolutely not right. One has to be able to critically look at where each one of these groups came from. Why are they here in the first place? There have been a lot of troubling headlines in mainstream Malaysian media, particularly in vernacular media, like in the Malay language, online editorials, as well as in Mandarin, etc., whereby some of the headlines have said that, I'm just translating into English, so-and-so market is now clean of migrants. This is in reference to the fact that a lot of the migrants, they have been working for very low paid jobs in a lot of the produce markets that provide the day-to-day necessities for Malaysians. But now, in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, also looking towards economic pressures on the state, there is a push towards removing completely migrants in particular from the very lowly paid jobs that they were actually, were their only access to making and scraping together some form of survival. Now, all of this is extremely dangerous rhetoric. And when we look towards the politicizing of hate speech, this is an excellent example. To give you a perspective, many of the journalist rights groups have actually received reports from fellow journalists who are unable to go on the record to explicitly make a complaint, but they have received directives from editorial managers and their editors that they are not to actually discuss or even write about migrants and refugees in a positive light. So this really helps to put in a nutshell the reason why it appears in the past couple of months when one goes online or when one checks out, let's say, an article on whichever publication, more often than not, you are seeing hate speech and xenophobia that targets migrants and refugees. It's not only become an editorial process, which is completely unethical, which completely goes against the values of press freedom and freedom of expression with regards to ethical journalism, but it also helps us to understand why the scapegoating of migrants and refugees is actually happening. It is not a flood. They have been here for decades. Many of them even have a first or sometimes even a second generation that has been born in Malaysia. These are long-term migrants and refugees whose basic problems and the reason why they actually fled their home country has still not been resolved. It is essential also for the Malaysian government to be sentient of the fact that migrants and refugees are not a burden on society. They want to contribute. Well, from everything that we know and that we read in international media and according to watchdog bodies such as Human Rights Watch, of course, we've also got UNHCR, it is quite clear, particularly with regards to the Rohingyas, that they are experiencing a genocide. They are fleeing what is a genocide from the Rakhine State area in Myanmar. This is absolutely not a disputable situation. And the fact that they are actually being refused landing in Malaysia, whereby even a boat that recently was trying to come ashore was able to come ashore, but only because it was broken and needed mending. Sources, according to them, are saying that the boat will actually be pushed back out with close to 200 packs once the boat is fixed. Now, this is not only using the whataboutery of international maritime law, but it is not in accordance to best practices or even the basic humanitarian rights. I'd like to quote a line from the poem Warsan Sher's poetry, where she basically said that you would not put your child or your family into a boat unless the water was safer than the land. It is quite literally that. Refugees and migrants, in particular, the Rohingyas who are experiencing mass-scale genocide in Rakhine State, are not willy-nilly leaving their country of origin. they are literally escaping to look for a means of not just survival, but to escape persecution and ethnic cleansing. It is high time that Malaysia in particular is able to not just rationalize, but outside of even a humanitarian factor, be able to integrate them into Malaysian society. I refer to an April 2019 report that was actually conducted by Ideas Malaysia, which is a think tank and research body, about the economic contribution of migrants. Now, their findings were that if the Malaysian government were to formalize the rights of refugees and migrants to live and work in Malaysia, they would actually be able to contribute over 3 billion ringgit by 2024 to Malaysia's GDP. 2024, it's not even 5 years away. So that shows that not only are refugees and migrants willing to be a vibrant and engaged part of Malaysian society, cutting them off from this access is not only, of course, a loss for them, but it's also a loss for Malaysia, not just social-culturally, but even economically. And of course, as we're looking towards COVID-19 recovery, it's important to also frame and phrase the fact that refugees are not only part of society, but they're also a contributing part of society. But if you cannot acknowledge their humanity first and foremost, then everybody stands to lose.
Says the Rohingya, they have been fleeing genocide from the early 70s. So they've been coming in here from the early 70s, and they come from a place where they are not allowed to have more than one child, where they are not allowed to even cross provinces without a special permit, and where they are targeted by the Burmese military. But having said that, we also have refugees from Somalia, from Sudan, Syria, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Palestine, Sri Lanka, and also within Burma itself, we have the Karen, Kachin, Shin, Mon, Shan, Zomi, and other ethnic groups. So all of them are fleeing either persecution, targeted persecution, internal war, and conflict. Now, Malaysia, it's important for us to understand that it is never the pull factor, because just now you said that, is it going to be easier for them in Malaysia? So why do they come here? It is never the pull factor. It's not that Malaysia is attractive or an attractive place for them where their rights will be recognized and respected, where they'll be able to have access to education, health, and work. So it is not that case. The fact is that it is easier because of visa restrictions or the lack of it for people to actually flee into Malaysia. So it's always the push factor, the fact that they cannot live in their home countries, that is forcing people to come. Now, I have done this work over the last 15 years, and I have had the privilege and opportunity to actually speak to many Malaysians about this. And I can safely say that 9 out of 10 Malaysians are still not able to differentiate between an economic migrant and a refugee. They do not really understand that there is a distinct difference here, where one is actually coming through to Malaysia because of better work opportunities and the ability to make food and other facilities available for their families back home. And the other one is actually fleeing because they will end up dead in their home countries. Now, over the last few months, primarily after the pandemic started, COVID-19, and we have seen over time in history that every time you have a pandemic, it's always the foreigners who are blamed. But here, we saw a targeted campaign, a very well coordinated targeted campaign against the Rohingya. Now, I'm just going to touch on what Philip has also asked about the fact that we have always welcomed refugees from different countries, and we are champions of the Palestinian cause. But, it's also important to understand and to remember that a few years ago, the former Prime Minister Najib Razak was also championing the cause of the Rohingya. In fact, he was the first leader in ASEAN who actually described the targeted persecution as genocide, way before even the UN report said that. So the thing is that, it's almost like whether it's the Palestinian cause or whether us embracing the Syrians and others, it seems as if though now, in retrospect, when I look back, like we were doing that just to score brownie points. Every time we wanted to talk about the Muslim Ummah or the Islamic Brotherhood, or we are all one, we are all together, then we use the refugee narrative as a way, as a convenient way for us to look good. That is exactly what Najib Razak did with the Rohingya, because every time the 1MDB scandal was threatening to drown him, he immediately wanted support. He wanted to come out looking like a Muslim leader, a capable, a Muslim leader who has got integrity. So he immediately latched onto the Rohingya issue. This is rather appalling, I must say. But having said that, this campaign that has happened and continues to happen, not just against the Rohingya, but it has now been extended to other refugee communities, and also targets human rights activists who speak up for the marginalized communities and against that kind of hate speech, racism, and xenophobia. Now, more than the targeted campaign, what really broke my heart was the response from Malaysia, which was beyond appalling. I don't even know how to describe it, where people were so scathing, where they couldn't be compassionate, where there were so many Malaysians who said, put them back at sea. Why are we even accepting them? Just push the boats back, or put some food into the boat. If possible, put some fuel and just push them back at sea. Let them go. This is Malaysia. This is for us. So that kind of a response from Malaysians was really disheartening. But having said that, I have been thinking about what could have contributed to this. And this is what I think, and I'll share it with you. Over the last few decades, we have seen dissatisfaction among different groups of Malaysians. One saying that they do not get the same kind of opportunities. The other one saying that they feel as if though they are being treated like third-class citizens. The other saying that, well, I did extremely well, but why can't I go to university, and go into the faculty that I want to go? Why can't I study medicine? Is it because of my race? Is it because of my religion? Is it because of my skin color? So we have already had such inequality, or Malaysians feeling that there is lack of an equal treatment for every one of us who are Malaysians, but who are Malaysians. And so you bring, people are already feeling that they're not getting enough, and you bring the refugee equation into this, and definitely it's not going to go down well, because Malaysians are now thinking that they are going to not even have that very little that was given to them, or literally those little bones that were thrown at them. They may not even have access to that anymore. So if we really want to look at the xenophobia, the racism, and the kind of hate speech that we have been seeing against the Rohingya and other refugee communities, we really need to sit down and look at our own society. We really need to look at how we have been treating all Malaysians, and we need to now look at ways in which we can make sure that all Malaysian citizens have equal access to opportunities. And that way, maybe, just maybe, you can create a society which is more welcoming, maybe, or I can just hope it does.
Also, in a sense, to set the net a bit wider, because whenever we talk about sentiments, we also have to be very, very sentient of the fact that where are all these sentiments able to foment, able to spread from? Today, it's all about the online sphere. Now, when it comes to that, I'd just like to share a couple of stats with you, because overall, when it comes to changing the sentiment or the dominant narrative towards marginalized groups like migrants and refugees, it's all about how are we going to hack hate capitalism and social media algorithms. Basically, what this means is that the tech sphere has been not only created by, but it is perpetuated by a very hegemonic patriarchal model. And now, that definitely does not lead into good reporting processes or best practices when it comes to what is allowed to stay online. So MCMC's 2018 Internet User Survey for Malaysia showed that 87.4% of Malaysians are internet users. That's 28.7 million people. And we've got a population of less than 35, 36 million. So that's a lot of Malaysians online. And in 2016, that percentage was just 76%. So there's leaps and bounds every single year in more and more Malaysians going online. However, another interesting data point is that cybersecurity Malaysia's research shows that Malaysians ignore journalism. They prefer social media, which increases their exposure to online hate speech and disinformation. So this all comes back down to and boils into what is the popular manner in which not just news but views reach us over the internet. It's literally two extremes. You're either watching cat videos and delicious food or exercise stuff, really positive things, or on the other hand, you're listening to violently racist, xenophobic, far-right commentary. And this is global, regardless of whether you live in Malaysia, whether you live in Thailand, Vietnam, or in the US or the UK. And that is simply because social media algorithms are built to amplify the extraordinary. So people have an extreme reaction when they see an incredibly cute puppy video. They also have an incredibly extreme reaction when they see something which is xenophobic, which fuels into pre-existing prejudices that they already have. And this combines with the fact that internet penetration rates in Malaysia come together with the fact that we do not have digital education or hygiene, which means that when it comes to the education system, nobody as a Malaysian who is online today has been educated via the overarching government school or university system to actually behave ethically and to behave even decently online. So that is why every single time you see headlines that are reporting the xenophobia in Malaysia that will also have a very skewed perspective, the sentiment is always to the right. So naturally, this serves as an echo chamber because the Malaysians who feel that their voice or their opinion has been validated by unethical media reporting, it is then amplified by the type of comments they leave, the type of discussions that start. I'll give you a simple example whereby the banning of migrants for Friday prayers in Malaysia was announced a week or two ago. Now, this comes on the back of the fact that the Sri Petaling Tabligh cluster stands as the single highest infection cluster for COVID-19 in Malaysia. So, and that was clearly not caused by migrants. It was a mixture of primarily Malaysians and yes, some other visitors who had come by to Malaysia for the Tabligh. So that is 48% of all cases of COVID-19 in Malaysia were caused by the Sri Petaling Tabligh cluster. And yet, banning migrants from Friday prayers becomes the tone of the day. Why is that? I mean, logic and science would demand regulating gatherings, not people, right? It's a virus. It does not discriminate. But at the same time, this sort of jingoism in a fragile state that has just undergone a transition, a fairly chaotic transition of power models, it demands otherwise. It allows for not only distraction, but it also allows for overriding sentiments to take charge of the discourse, rather than focusing on how we can actually come together to not only make access better for marginalized migrants and refugees, but also for marginalized Malaysians.
We have always looked at the Rohingya when we are in downtown Kuala Lumpur, or looked at a Bangladeshi migrant worker and just quickly crossed the street because we think that, oh my God, there's always been this narrative that has been created that, the Bangladeshi person or the Bangladeshi migrant worker is here to steal your wife or your daughter. And it doesn't really help, like what Tehmina says, when, we have local media that also perpetuates, this narrative. And like what she says, that particular news article which talked about having cleaned out the Selayang market from migrant workers so that now it is safe for others to go and shop there. That's appalling. And I've also been told that migrant workers and refugees, particularly the Rohingya who live around there, have also been denied entry into the Selayang wholesale market. So they can't even go in and buy their food. So, I'm going to just use this opportunity to ask the local media to actually start fighting, fighting to put together or to put out there a better narrative. They can start, for example, by using the word undocumented migrant workers as opposed to illegal migrant workers, because no human being is illegal. I do know, having come from a news media background myself, that it's incredibly difficult. Sometimes your editorial policy, is just fixed, and it's not like you're pals with your editor-in-chief. It's very difficult to actually push. But I would like to see each and every media worker pushing against that kind of hate speech, pushing against putting forth that kind of xenophobia and slur, into their media reporting. I think this is really important. But, I just would like to answer the second question where somebody is asking, I said that the kind of, they would like to know whether, is it true that the majority of the hate speech for the Rohingya came from the majority race? Now, the thing is, whether it's Malays, Indians, or Chinese, they were all scathing about the Rohingya. Everyone was talking against the Rohingya. The xenophobia, the racism came from everyone. And yes, the Malays are the majority race, but if you ask them, they will say that, oh my God, we feel like our opportunities are being taken away. As Bumiputra, we deserve more. So it looks like there's no end to this. And the other question is about the pushback, about some people saying that one day they will ask for citizenship. Let me tell you this. I have worked with refugees for more than 15 years now. Like I said, I started working with the Rohingya first, and each and every refugee I have met only have one intention: to go home. Home where they were born, their parents were born, where they have a history, where their parents and grandparents have a history, where they grew. A home is the place where they actually grew up in, where they made their first friends. Nobody, trust me when I say this, nobody wants to live in Malaysia forever. It's incredibly difficult for them, but more than that, everyone wants to go home. So nobody will come here and ask for citizenship. Now, this kind of narrative is coming from the government. A few years ago, when I was working for Press TV out of Iran, I've done interviews with sitting MPs from UMNO, and they always said that, oh my God, if we allowed the refugees to come in, then the floodgates will open and more thousands and thousands will come here. That's not true. Firstly, we already have refugees coming into Malaysia, and all we need to do is come up with a proper mechanism to process and to vet them. Not to come up with explanation like we'll have more people coming in, or they will end up asking for more rights. They'll end up wanting to be citizens here, because that's just not right. That's not an accurate representation of the sentiments by the refugees themselves. We have got Janaganita, we have got Swaram that does quite a bit of work. And the thing is that it's interesting, because even women's aid organization that works on rights of women and children, they also work on the rights of refugee women and children, for example. And internationally, of course, even regionally, you have Human Rights Watch, you have ASEAN Burma, you have the Manusia Foundation, and internationally you have Refugees International and many other organizations that actually work on these rights. In Malaysia, primarily now, a lot of many CSOs have actually come together to vehemently condemn the kind of xenophobia against migrants and refugees, and that's commendable.
Absolutely. I think that particularly in the current climate, it has been extremely difficult for Malaysian organizations who also want to have a larger, more visible role in advocating for refugees and migrants, particularly those impacted by the COVID-19 lockdowns or the EMCOs, because of the fact that there is very little, just like Mahi said, ethical coverage in mainstream media that portrays refugees and migrants not necessarily in a positive light, but as a matter of fact. The facts are very rarely reported upon. There is too much of embellished language, too much of targeted xenophobia and racism and colorism in the headlines as well. I also refer to a recent article that was put up by an educational institution whereby somebody who is an academic from that institution actually wrote an article that spoke about the cleansing of Malaysia from migrants and refugees. Now, such dangerous narratives are the ones which, once again, get a lot of not just airtime, but then it becomes discussed as though this is something which should be normalized. And the more this becomes mainstream, the more it falls upon the fact that media actually needs to abide by certain critical standards. Now, one thing which is missing from the media dynamic is also something which I have been involved in, which has been the setting up of a Malaysian Media Council. Now, plenty of countries around the world have media councils, which basically perform the function of ensuring that media outlets, be they broadcast and television, etc., are performing their due diligence in factual, ethical reporting of all issues. So when it comes to something like the migrant and refugee scenario in Malaysia, it is absolutely essential also that not only journalist rights groups, but also the Malaysian media works towards applying more pressure upon the government of the day to bring this together. Because it not only impacts media owners, but ultimately it impacts what kind of perspectives media readers and consumers hold of such issues. So if we look at organizations that are wanting to have a bigger role, particularly NGOs, they are also unable to because they would have to do a lot of the work that they're doing as quietly as possible. And there is a lot more going on behind the scenes than what we actually see reflected in mainstream media. So it gets left to the organizations to do all their reaching out campaigns, etc., by themselves, either via their social media campaigns, because it is not favorable to be put under the spotlight for essentially doing humanitarian work. That perspective is only able to change when the overall scenario becomes more conducive to everybody speaking up and speaking out, which is why I think in recent weeks we've seen a lot of movement amongst the younger, the under 24 demographic of Malaysians, as well as, for example, international students in Malaysia who have been speaking out about these issues. So you'll only see more movement in the mainstream arena if a couple of different factors come together to ensure a safer space for not only refugees and migrants, but also for organizations, NGOs, little ones, big ones, that are working towards helping them.
If I may add, just one point. Over the last 3 months, we have also seen many local NGOs, Tenaga Nita, Buku Dapo Jalanan or Buku Jalanan, I'm not sure, and another organization together with Heidi Kwa's Refuge for Refugees that gave every week food for more than 1,000 families. And we also have seen many other NGOs, big and small, that have involved themselves in aid distribution. So even Beyond Borders, a small non-profit that I run, we were able to distribute food provisions, sanitizers, face masks, sanitary napkins and soaps to more than 4,000 families. That's more than 25,000 people. So together, I believe that, you know, we would have reached out to a few 100,000 people. So now, having said that, I must say that many of those efforts were made possible by corporate organizations, but also by many Malaysians who very generously donated their money. So that, I must say, was heartwarming.
Saying as well, the Kita Jaga Kita, or We Take Care of Ourselves hashtag that was started by incredible author in Malaysia, Hannah Alkaf, and her collective of folks. It also includes many, many organizations working and striving and working tirelessly around the clock to aid migrants and refugees. So it's also very important to remember that there are, at the same time, a lot of Malaysians who do consider migrants and refugees as part of our community. Don't be distracted in that sense by the mainstream rhetoric that might be normalizing hate speech and xenophobia against refugees, because also the bare basic survival of refugees and migrants under MCO that is still continuing. It's just in the recovery period, but at least in the initial 90 odd days, their survival was enabled principally and primarily by small Malaysian NGOs and NGIs crowdsourcing and crowdfunding necessities, money, etc., everything. So yeah, Kita Jaga Kita, I think, really shows not just the diversity, but the fact that concerned Malaysians absolutely do consider and treat migrants and refugees as part of our own community.
Every time you talk about the refugees, you know, people always talk about ratifying the 1951 UN Refugee Convention and the 67 protocols. Now, ratifying, signing is one thing, ratifying means aligning them with domestic laws. Now, this is going to take a long time, 10 years if we are lucky, if not longer. Do we really have that kind of time to wait? No. So I think it's really about time that Malaysia starts looking at existing legal framework to enable refugees their rights. For example, the IMM 13 under the Immigration Act, which allows refugees the right to work, and this legal framework can be expanded to include the right to education and healthcare. It's not like the IMM 13 has not been used before. It has been used, especially during the time of the former Prime Minister. There are just too many former Prime Ministers, so let me qualify this. Dr. Mahathir Mohamad, and where he used the IMM 13 to give identity cards to people, to migrants who have actually come into Sabah, for example. It was known as the infamous Project IC. So the thing is that, do we have the existing legal framework? Yes. Do we have the political will to do that? Definitely no. So, but I think that, you know, this is the right time. It's the most opportune moment for Malaysia to do the right thing. We have always talked about, or we have always used the Palestinian discourse as a way of championing ourselves as being, you know, as being part of the Muslim Brotherhood, as part of the Ummah. But have we really done anything on the ground to support refugees? The answer is no. We have built field hospitals in Cox's Bazar, rightfully so, but have we given enough access to refugees who go to Malaysian hospitals? The answer is no. So this is really the time to stop the hypocrisy and for the Malaysian government to actually act up, to actually have the political will to act. And, you know, we have lost precious time in the last 3 months. And can we afford to lose more time? No. Now we are seeing what's happening in Malaysia. The government has to send a strong message to the Malaysian public that that kind of racism and xenophobia against the refugees is a no-no. And the first way, and the first step that they can do towards making that possible is to actually look at various ways in which the right to work can be made possible first. And the best way to do it is to look at existing legal framework and therefore the IMM 13.
Building on Mahi's point about the IMM 13 and going back to the IDEA's report on rights of migrants to work in Malaysia, I'd also like to quote that their research proved that contributions to GDP from migrants and refugees, if they are allowed access to education, could increase to over 6.5 billion ringgit each year by 2040, together with an annual contribution in taxes of over 250 million ringgit. Now, I am quoting all these facts and approximate figures of the economic benefits that could be brought about for the state by formalizing right to education and, of course, right to more skilled work opportunities, because of the fact that it is incredibly difficult to get states to align together with a strictly humanitarian perspective. That we can quite safely assume, due to the sheer lack of political will, is not a very sensitized position. And it will be very hard to work towards that. But what is always clear and cannot be disputed is facts and figures, ringgit and cents. And if you're able to say that, look, this is how many billion the refugees will bring in commercial as well as economic value, it is not the ideal humanitarian perspective. I agree with that. But it is a testament of what they bring in worth of not just value, but in terms of building up the country where they are also going to be residents. So it's always important to bring that as part of the narrative, to highlight such projects, to also look into supporting such research, as well as for those who are interested, to answer Philip Gann's question just now, how can we take it down and away from the top-down media narrative? As concerned Malaysians, as good citizens, you can always take on the mantle of not just educating ourselves a lot more about the scenario, but writing open letters to the editor, particularly for problematic media outlets, especially the vernacular media. Reporting hate speech and targeted xenophobia on the online space, particularly on Facebook and Twitter, where there is just a morass of xenophobia when it comes to marginalization issues. Petitioning your MP, writing to your MP, and finding also other concerned members of parliament, and always advocating for the economic and political perspective integrated with the humanitarian perspective. Because it is impossible to exist as a human being, as a resident, as a citizen, anywhere in the world without having all three perspectives melded together. If we are only approaching it from the humanitarian perspective, unfortunately, we'll only be preaching to the choir out there who believe in the equitable treatment of all human beings regardless. That is not necessarily or anyhow the perspective of governance. But what they do understand is facts and figures, ringgits and cents, dollars, GDP. Integrate that into the narrative. And then I think it will be a much more targeted, cumulative, and achievable perspective when it comes to not marginalizing migrants and refugees.
The government has to first and foremost have the political will. Now, I know that there were at least 3 petitions which were sent to the Malaysian government, one by all global non-governmental organizations, one by local non-governmental organizations and CSOs, and the other one by regional CSOs and NGOs and NGIs as well. But, you know, then you have the defense minister, the senior defense minister, saying that, yes, we have gone through all the petitions, and yes, we know that the human rights people are all up against arms when it comes to detention of migrants as well as refugees, but these rates will continue. So the thing is that how do you actually deal with a government that is so tone deaf, that just does not want to look at the fact that there is a humanitarian crisis here and that we are not responding adequately to that? Now, the IDEAS report is a fantastic piece of work that was done by IDEAS, but the thing is that, and that has been quoted time and again, you know, the government knows that, you know, the refugees are capable of contributing economically, but the government still does not want to listen. There has been so many concerted efforts by CSOs and NGOs to actually engage with the government. And when I talk about the government, I'm also talking about Pakatan Harapan, which in its election manifesto said that it will ratify the convention, which also said that it will allow the right to work to all refugees who have got UNHCR cards. But did that happen? Was anything made, any step or any action taken during their 1.5 years, was it, of rule? No. So how do you actually go about doing this? One way is, of course, for Malaysians to actually highlight the plight and to show that they are in support and in solidarity with the refugees through, you know, the newspaper and other media channels, as Tehmina pointed out. Today is World Refugee Day. If I may ask, you know, it'll be great if each and every one of us can actually make a concerted effort to get to know a refugee. Sit with them, buy them coffee, talk to them, listen to what they have got to say, so that instead of demonizing them or thinking that maybe that narrative which is out there may be true, maybe they are here to take away our jobs and our daughters, we will be able to see that they are just people who are like us, with the same hopes and dreams for themselves, with the same aspirations for their children, you know, and then maybe we can introduce them to our friends and our family so that this conversation can continue. You know, and also on a personal capacity, over the last 5 years, we have made efforts to hold a refugee festival, which showcases the talent of the refugee communities. There are musicians, theater people, singers, dancers, poets, and also theater artists there. And what we did last year was we took the refugee festival away from Publica, and we brought them to the Nigel Gardner plantation so that we can really connect the refugee and the Malaysian population. And after the 2 hours, Malaysians, these are poor Malaysians who are plantation workers who hardly have enough for themselves, came to me and said, "Oh my God, Mahi, we really want to help these people. We don't have much money, but we just want to do something. We can't not do something." Yeah. So I think what is really important is for us to be able to come together as one people, to be able to take some time out to actually understand what's happening with the refugees, and to understand the conversations, the global conversations that are actually happening, and then to lobby our government to actually do something. There has to be pressure on this government particularly, because it is a government that also does not have the mandate of the people. So it is unconscionable that they continue to rule, but it's also clear that that much more effort needs to be put in by everyone involved. You, me, every other Malaysian, a student, an activist, a CSO, an NGO, and everyone else, to be able to pressure the government. And on an ASEAN level, I think Malaysia has an added responsibility, especially where the Rohingya are concerned, to lobby the Burmese government to stop the targeted persecution. Now, why do I say that? Because Malaysia was instrumental in bringing Burma back into the ASEAN fold. And Malaysia has taken leadership. Malaysia has been on the forefront when it comes to talking about other issues involving refugees, the Palestinian cause, for example. But now, just because of this non-interference policy, which is archaic in itself, Malaysia is actually keeping quiet. It does this pressuring of Burma on and off, but it has to be more consistent and more targeted. And we really need to get the rest of ASEAN to actually come together to pressure Burma to stop the targeted persecution. Now, what else can happen globally? There has to be sanctions, not economic sanctions, definitely not economic sanctions, because it will only go to hurt the poor people of Burma, for example. But what else can you do? You can make sure that the bank accounts of all these ruling elite and the army generals are all frozen. You can make sure that there is a travel ban on them. And you can also make sure that there is an arms embargo. We really need to think about this from a local point of view, from a regional point of view, and a global point of view. We really need to say that human lives are more important than businesses and diplomatic ties. It is only when all of us can come together as one will the persecution against the Rohingya and the Syrians and the Egyptians and the Pakistanis and Sri Lankan Tamils and whatever else will actually stop.
Just to also state very clearly, I'm in agreement with Mahi that it is not so much that governments of the day have political will, or in the case of, let's say, Pakatan Harapan, sufficient political will. So what matters ultimately at the end of the day is that voters make sure that their voices are heard. So with regards to the fact that it looks like an increasingly likely event that snap elections will be called for in Malaysia, it is extremely important for all Malaysian voters, not only the youth, to ensure first and foremost that they're registered, but also to actively work towards not just anti-racism, but educating themselves about the xenophobia and challenges faced by migrants and refugees. And the next step would be to actively advocate for and support MPs who also have a pro-migrant, pro-refugee, pro-humanitarian stance. Ask these essential questions of those who claim to be representing you. We have a representative democracy here in Malaysia, which is why it is absolutely essential that that one person, man or woman, that you choose as your MP, as your representative, truly represents not just a rights perspective, but one that involves social justice. So it's very important for Malaysian voters to start asking the questions of anti-migrant and anti-refugee sentiment and putting your MPs on the spot as well. There are quite a few wonderful MPs, Charles Santiago, Kasturi Pato, Hannah Yo, who are already, They have been brave enough to step up and actually take the mandate and talk about equitable treatment for migrants and refugees as well. But at the same time, it's important to ensure that it doesn't just become silofied. It needs to spread until you have as many MPs, as many representatives, as many senators as possible talking about these issues, talking about integration. And what comes after that is also that we need to remember that having justice, having a rights perspective for refugees is also, it's a feminist issue. Yesterday was the International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence and Conflict 2020. Today is World Refugee Day. And while we may think of the issue of sexual violence and conflict being a faraway issue that only perhaps affects women and girls in Somalia, in Sudan, in Syria, that is not true. There have been varying reports of the fact that Rohingya women and girls suffer and are raped on their boat journeys all on the way to Malaysia and Thailand, that they are raped and sexually abused in the transition camps at the border. So this exemplifies the vulnerability of women and girls in this conflict. It is a humanitarian issue, it is a justice issue, it's a feminist issue. And the more we know about it, we don't just keep the information to ourselves. We help to widen the discussion, and we help to take it to the highest levels possible. And each one of us, all Malaysian voting citizens, do have this access. And this should be happening, should have been happening yesterday.
They are still in detention. We have already seen a batch of the migrant workers who were deported home. The refugees, as far as I know, even those who were detained in Selayang are still in detention. And usually what happens is when refugees are detained by immigration, and when someone actually sees that or is able to report about that to the UNHCR, then UNHCR officers will actually go into the detention centers and register them there and then. So as a way of actually getting them out of detention. But that was not possible for them because of COVID-19, and they were not allowed access into immigration detention camps. So what we do know is that there have been allegations that there's no possibility of social distancing in detention camps. And I'm sure you already know that the Bukit Jalil detention camp has the highest number of cases. But how have NGOs been working? What they have been doing is, of course, making lots of noise when refugees and migrants were arrested, because they know that this is going to be a disaster, and rightfully so. There were many of us who were screaming until we were blue in the face, telling the government to stop the detention, to stop the raids. But then, we were also aware of the fact that every time there was a extended MCO, we knew that that was the MO, where after a few days of the extended MCO, there were the barbed wires and will go up, and the next thing you know, they are raiding. And this is actually disgusting, because all of us, I'm sure, remember that the senior defense minister came out in the open and said, please come out, please get yourself tested. This is really about coming together and mitigating, as a way of mitigating the COVID-19 pandemic. All of us need to get tested, all of us need to get treated, and do not be afraid, there will be no arrest. But we had no qualms about going back on our words, and that is appalling. But what the NGOs have also done is to make sure that soaps and sanitizers were also made available to those, not just to the migrants and refugees, but also to others who did not have the privilege of social distancing, whether it was the Orang Asli community or poor people who were living in difficult conditions, in PPR flats, in low-cost flats, many living in one room, those kinds of things. So, but the thing is, having done it myself over the last 3 months, I would really like to say this, that yes, we have done our best, and yes, we have had the reach, we have had the support from many Malaysians and also corporate organizations, but it would have been better if there was also cooperation from the government, for example, because while aid was made possible for people during COVID-19, but the policy was kind of vague. Many migrants and refugees did not get the aid. And then at some point, the government said that the aid is only for Malaysians. Now, if anything, we could have learned from Singapore, where it actually said that, the migrants are actually a part of our society, and we really need to look at the living conditions, and we really need to embrace them and make sure that they are being treated and not left on their own. And I think that, if there was one important lesson that we could have learned from the COVID-19 pandemic, is the fact that in order for me to be fine, you need to be fine. In order for you to be fine, Tehmina has to be fine. All of us need to be fine together. There's no such thing as discriminating the migrant population or the refugees and thinking that, we will be okay. I mean, I hate it every day when I read news and it says that, we have this many infections, but this many foreigners. And then, we are all thrilled because there are only 3 Malaysians. I'm like, is that how we react? Is that the kind of society that we have actually become?
Absolutely. What I want to highlight is the fact that there is disgusting systemic racism in action here when it comes to how the migrants and refugees are being treated in detention centers. There are Facebook groups full of Caucasian tourists who are stranded in Malaysia, with them happily reporting that, that immigration has extended their social visit visas until August the 31st and even given them 14 days extended grace period to leave. Contrast this with not just migrants and refugees and how they are being treated under detention at these centers where COVID is spreading like rapid fire, but also with tourists from India who actually came in here on a valid visa and became stuck, of course, due to the COVID lockdown and nabbed for overstaying and stuffed into, once again, the detention centers. One of these individuals, a man in his late 40s, has actually passed away of COVID. The body was found in the detention center, and it was testing positive for COVID when he had tested negative before being placed in the detention center. Yes, this is a tourist in question, but also a tourist who would have had a skin tone that is marginalized against. So we can never forget the dimension of racism and colorism in the xenophobia and the anti sentiment that is becoming so mainstream in Malaysia. It's very important to remember that when it comes to the RMCO even, which will end on the 31st of August, you still have plenty of migrant and refugee communities who continue to be even more vulnerable due to the fact that they have been cut off from any access to, number one, making a living. So it really boils down to how many more NGOs and NGIs are going to be able to continue amplifying their efforts for not just fundraising. There's also NGOs who have come together collectively to fundraise specifically only to ensure that migrant and refugee women who are pregnant and literally about to give birth will be able to afford the medical bills. So there are so many grassroots efforts happening, and there is a constant need. It is a bottomless pit, and I think we all have to very collectively rise against, because the fact is this black hole of need, this endless cycle of them being marginalized, has actually been created by the overarching social, political, and legal conditions imposed upon by governments and states. So that is what Malaysians have to be sentient of, and coming together collaboratively so that you are able to not only have the energy and the sensitization to report a terrible post or a tweet that spews hate speech, but also take it to the highest level. Take it to the highest level and consistently ask for and demand that migrants, refugees, marginalized communities, everyone in Malaysia is actually able to have the best access. We pride ourselves here on our healthcare system. We truly do. And while it is excellent in many ways, that excellence is something which should be a basic human right for everyone, regardless of where you come from.
The Malaysian government so far has failed to show leadership, in that I've not seen any of the cabinet ministers deputy ministers or even the prime minister coming out publicly to ask for the racism, the xenophobia, and the hate speech to be stopped. You know, we have only seen a civil servant, the DG of the Health Ministry, Dr. Hisham, who actually said that we cannot treat migrants with disrespect. We really need to look into the living conditions, and who said that that kind of hate speech and xenophobia and racism is a no-no. You know, if I may, I would really like to see the Prime Minister make an announcement asking Malaysians to be more respectful. I would like to see cabinet ministers and deputy ministers doing the same, senators, members of parliament coming out openly to say that, yes, we may have differences of opinion and ideas and views when it comes to migrants and refugees, but we need to stay united against racism, xenophobia, hate speech, bullying, and even, you know, physical violence and death threats against not just the vulnerable communities, but also against human rights activists. We have seen rape threats, for example, against human rights activists. We really need to hear more voices coming together to say, this is a no-no. So far, we haven't done that. And if I may, I would really like to make a request to the media to start from today using the word undocumented migrant workers as opposed to illegal migrant workers. For media workers to come together and to say, enough is enough. We cannot be writing about narratives that actually perpetuates that kind of racism and xenophobia. We can come together and use our voices and our power as writers, as journalists, as filmmakers, as photographers, any other media worker, to actually push and lobby for, you know, for the ending of slurs, for example, and racism and xenophobia by the local media as well.
In light of today being World Refugee Day, I would really like to emphasize that there is so much that concerned Malaysians can do. Have those difficult conversations, starting with the lowest common denominator, which might just be a racist family member. It is hard to have these conversations, but it is way past time that anybody concerned about basic decency and humanitarian rights for migrants and refugees has these conversations. I've called out my parents about their latent racism, their xenophobia against migrants and refugees, and so should all of us. Because when it comes together as an increasing movement, follow the hashtags. There's Migrant Juga Manusia, there's also Step with Refugees that you guys have created, and not only amplify the voices, but also make the time to understand that it's about education, not revisionism. What we're seeing a lot in mainstream media right now is that there is a lot of revisionism around the origins of undocumented migrant workers or refugees, but it's important to not only add your voice into it, but make sure that you demand accountability of the powers that be. The powers that be could be in your own personal sphere. It could be the school you go to. It could be the office that you work at. It could be your work WhatsApp group that is sharing xenophobic jokes, that is sharing racist jokes. It starts from there. The movement only gets bigger and sustains outside of World Refugee Day if every one of us is doing the anti-racist work every day as well. And I would also like to echo Mahi's call that it is time for journalists, for editors, for media outlets to not only run ethical coverage, but to also amplify positive coverage to be able to shift Malaysian perspectives into an education mindset. I'd also like to highlight the SUHAKAM, the Human Rights Commission of Malaysia. One of their plans that got aborted halfway due to the change in government was the fact that they were about to introduce textbooks for Malaysian schools for the upper primary and lower secondary level regarding human rights. Each little step made towards education matters. And it is not as easy as saying that, all right, the older generation is too old to learn, and the younger generation are too young to learn. No, nobody is too old or too young. Everybody needs to learn now, because ultimately it helps us to have a thriving ecosystem in our own communities. And this coming during the time of the COVID-19 pandemic has never made the matter more urgent. As states turn within themselves globally, it is time to also look very, very critically at who do we already have here under our roofs. Migrants, refugees, marginalized people, the B40 community, the disabled, LGBTQ. It is important to center all of their perspectives in order to center all of us. That's all.
Thank you, Tehmina. Thank you, Mahi. It was an absolute pleasure.